Everybody, and welcome to Alan History Nerd. This is a special edition of an Aside with Alan as I take an early look at the US 2020 election and what's happened and what it all means. Obviously, not everything is finalised by now. Biden has claimed victory, but Trump is yet to accept it. So there are still some things in the air, but there's some really interesting stuff that's come out, and I want to try and explain a bit about what's been going on. Well, it's been a really nail-biting count. So every day seems to blend in one day into the other for me at the moment, as I get up thinking they must have finished counting them by now, and they haven't. And then I stay up until early hours of the morning continuing to watch it and thinking they must announce it, finalise it soon. And it has just gone on and on day after day like that. It's been highly addictive. It's been highly exciting because one of the great things with the US one compared to the UK is you get the live count, so you can see the numbers going up bit by bit. I know I've spent endless hours following it. I'm sure lots of you guys have as well. I've particularly enjoyed CNN's coverage with John King and his magic wall. I definitely want one of those for my classroom. That looks much better than my whiteboard. Now, because of COVID-19, this has been a highly unusual and highly unpredictable election. Now, obviously, what it's done is it's affected the number of people who have voted. It's affected the way that people have voted. It's dictated for a lot of people which way they voted. So they might have voted by post because of they're fearful of COVID-19. They might have voted early because they didn't want to turn up on the day and they'll be there in huge crowds like they normally have. They might actually have changed. They might have been supporter of Trump and then just stopped supporting him because of his failures over COVID-19. All of this makes it highly unpredictable because the normal things which pollsters and experts and stuff put into place and go, well, because of this will happen. This group vote like that group vote like this. Well, or we'll know this about the results by then. None of that's really applied. So one of the bits where you come out and why the election looks a little bit odd is because, well, it is a little bit odd. So it's not been predictable in the way before. And I know I've made predictions with myself which have looked like they're going to be quite way off the mark when those final votes are counted. And I've also said things have gone along. I remember saying about Pennsylvania at one point, there's no way Biden could make up that big a gap, and then he did. And the reason, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong going on. It just means it's unusual. It's working in a different way to normal. Obviously, the other thing that really throws a lot of stuff into the 2020 election is Trump himself. He is highly divisive. He has a group of highly devoted supporters. It almost it gets to the stage of a bit of a cult of personality in some ways. And then he's got opponents who they just can't stand him. They absolutely hate his guts in a lot of ways. So, and we've seen the huge celebrations that have followed in a lot of the cities once the kind of results have come out. He's also very volatile. He doesn't follow the normal rules of how things are done. I mean, this is why he won in 2016, because he was this outsider. He was the candidate who wasn't a politician. But it just means he doesn't behave like you would expect. I mean, the numbers now look really quite clear. A lot of the stuff he says is absolute nonsense. But because of this volatility, it's added that extra layer to what is going on. Because if we had two conventional candidates, then certain things would have happened at certain points through this last week, and particularly in the last 24 hours, which just haven't. There hasn't been a concession, for example, which is just normally what would happen. Because we're not there. It's not like, I mean, there's lots of parallels being drawn to 2020, but it's not like 2020. 2020 it came down to one state, Florida. One state's not going to turn this round for Trump. The fact that all the states do things differently, and this has been a really fascinating thing to watch during the week. So places like Florida, we went through really quite quickly, and what we had there is they pre-counted a lot of the early votes and postal votes, whilst in the Midwest they weren't allowed to, and therefore we had the votes on the day, and then we had this huge wait as all the postal votes were counted afterwards. The other thing that we get in America is quite rapidly shifting demographics. So as the size of populations and the groups of people who live in different states changes, then the vote in that place shifts, and places that you look at and go, well, that has been Republican for this length of time, that has been Democrat for this length of time. Now, in lots of states that stays the same, but in some there's fundamental things changing, and places like Nevada and Arizona and Georgia are some of the states that are really affected by this. Because the polls in 2016 were just wrong, that's added a great deal of uncertainty, because we went in and the polls were saying Biden was going to win and was going to win quite comfortably. But myself and lots of other people just didn't quite believe it, because they said Clinton was going to win and she didn't. Now, it might actually turn out, once we get to the final results and everything's been counted, that actually the polls weren't massively out this time round. I mean, Biden has an enormous lead in the popular vote, well over 4 million as I speak, and again, as is the joy of politics, if you listen to this in the future, then that might well, I think that will expand. I think we might well be talking ultimately of over 5 million gap in the popular vote. The other thing, and this is a wonderful thing for democracy, this was a huge voter turnout. So we're talking in the high 60s as a percentage of voter turnout. We're thinking about 150 million votes. I think it's 145 million have been counted already. And therefore, we can talk a lot about how America is divided and how difficult this is going to make everything. But and this is a really important thing in politics, it's definitely engaged. And engagement, political engagement, is a really important part of democracy, and we've seen that with spades in America. There is just tons and tons of engagement and strong reactions on either side to what's happened with the result. And again, Trump his main claims about having won loads and loads of votes, and he has won loads and loads of votes. He has won record numbers of votes, but Biden's won even more. And the huge rise in voter turnout means, again, we've got groups where voter turnout is normally lower. So, for example, younger people, the black population, Hispanic population, groups of people where the vote is normally lower, the vote turnout percentage is lower, that's gone up really dramatically, and that's had a big impact on the election, has made it more unpredictable. So what's been going on? We've been watching days and days and the counts and trying to keep on top of it. Well, the reality is obviously Trump can rally and rail about what's going on, but it's not federal government that controls what happens on elections. It's controlled by the states. So the state legislature will make rules on things like postal votes and when they have to arrive, and which ones get and how they get counted and when they get counted, on how many polling stations they are, how the polling stations are allowed to operate, what you need to do to have an absentee ballot, when voters who live abroad or military votes, when they have to arrive by, when the postmark has to be for it to count on election day. We had places where there was drive-in bits where you could vote, and again, so you get huge variation from state to state. And you had some places which got to election day and already counted all their postal votes, and therefore we would tend to see then what tended to happen is Trump's voters tended to vote on the day and Biden's voters tended to vote by post. So if you started one way, then if you started with it, you'd already counted all the postal votes, then Biden started in the lead and Trump caught him up. If you had it, so you counted the votes on the day first, like they did in the Midwest, and counted the postal votes later, then Trump started off massively in the lead and Biden caught him up. And so we got a huge variation because of this, and we get the variation because the states are different, and each state has its own rules. And so a lot of the judgments about what could happen with the election day are made by the state's Supreme Court, which is different to the federal Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. So each individual state will have its own Supreme Court, and most of the rulings on elections and counts and observers and things like that, that's made at state level. Ultimately, it could be challenged up in the federal court, but really, I know this is one interesting, particularly with a Supreme Court that is loaded with very conservative judges, that really the kind of conservative line is that things that are dedicating the Constitution to state level should be done at state level, and federal government and federal officials should keep their noses out of it. And so something that's been upheld at state level is unlikely to be overturned at federal level, particularly by a conservative court that takes quite literal kind of interpretation of the Constitution. So the Secretary of State for the state runs the vote, and so you might have seen on TV people like Kathy Boockvar, who is in charge in Pennsylvania, and they oversee the election. And sometimes it depends on the state. Sometimes, like in Pennsylvania, you'll have a Democrat who's in charge, and in places like Georgia, you'll have a Republican in charge. Now, whether they're Democrat or Republican really shouldn't make any difference, because they have sworn to oversee fair and trustworthy elections, and this has always been the case. And within every county, which is the subdivisions of the states, and again, you might have seen this if you've watched things on the Magic Wall. You might have seen that you get the big map of the state, and then it's broken down. You can see all the individual counties, and the counties will be very different in their nature, but each county will have state officials there, and they'll run the count, and then they report them to the Secretary of State. Secretary of State is accountable to the governor, and that's how it's run. Federal government plays no role really, outside a couple of key bits. Ultimately, we might end up in the Supreme Court with cases of the alleged voter fraud, if any of that exists and gets through the state system, then that might end up in the Supreme Court. And the other thing the federal government controls is the postal service. And one of the big controversies is Trump tried to suppress the postal vote by making it very, very difficult and bringing in rules and regulations on the postal system. And he interfered with the election in that way before it happened. And that really is the long and the short of it in terms of what federal government's role is in running these elections. And that might sound odd because these are electing people to federal government, but it's a state affair, and that's why the counts have been going at different speeds. I mean, one of the things you will notice is like the stuff on TV is projections. So if you go on one of the maps on CNN or BBC or somewhere like that, and you click on it, you might well see that. I mean, California, they're miles off having finished the count. I mean, California will be Democrat. I mean, there's something like a 4 million lead they've got. But the pressure really, as we've seen, falls on those states where it's really close, because those final 5-10% make a huge difference, or 1 or 2%, final 1 or 2% can make a huge difference. For example, in Georgia, whilst in other states you just know miles out and you can see the direction it's going. One of the things that happened in Pennsylvania is we could see the direction of travel very, very clearly. I think what will happen over the next day or so is Biden's lead in Pennsylvania will get even bigger, and that's what the statisticians are saying as well. So debunking some of Trump's claims. So the postal vote difference, he says it's very mysterious and what's going on. Well, it's very easy to explain. He told his supporters not to vote by post, and Biden promoted voting by post because Biden was concerned about the welfare of his voters, and he's saying, well, don't go to crowded polling stations, just vote early, vote by post. It's a perfectly valid way of doing it, as it is in our country as well. It's a perfectly safe way of doing it, so do that. And Trump, I think, because he knew that he was likely to lose, because he knew that it was going to be postal votes that were going to cost him, tried to cast as much doubt as he possibly could, both before the election, during the election, and the aftermath of the election, on the validity of postal voting. Therefore, when you're counting postal votes in Pennsylvania, as they have been over the last few days, and they've been coming out kind of 70-80% in favour of Biden, it's not a surprise because of the attitude of the two candidates. And what Trump has done is he has deliberately spread misinformation. And then he acted as he did during the count, because what he wanted to do is he wanted everyone to declare him the winner in Pennsylvania whilst he was miles ahead, even though he knew that what the postal vote was going to do was going to mean that Biden would catch him and probably go past him. But that was the only way he could win. And I think that is one of the big things he's shown us about Trump is interested in winning. He's not necessarily interested in democracy. And it might be that. It might be he doesn't understand the system. I mean, it's very clear. I mean, the actions of Republicans in the Pennsylvania Congress have meant that they couldn't count the votes until after Election Day. So that was going to be the case. Trump was going to start ahead, Biden was going to start behind, Biden was going to catch up, and so there has been an attempt to make something out of something where there isn't really anything there. I mean, there was a really big one where they had the people covering up the windows so people couldn't see in. Well, that's one of those bits where how misleading photos can be. If you take the photo and all you can see is people covering the walls to stop people seeing the see the people carrying votes, then it looks quite dodgy, doesn't it? But if you then took a photo from a different direction that saw the big bank of press and observers of who were still inside, who could see what was going on in the voter count, then you could go, well, yeah, that people not being able to film through the windows doesn't mean that nobody's there watching what's going on. Now, another bit of it shows a complete lack of complete lack of understanding or deliberate misinformation. So he talks about Democrats were stealing the election, were stealing the vote, and were suppressing his vote and discarding his votes and putting ones in that didn't exist. Well, actually, some of the states he talks about this being, notably Georgia, aren't Democrat controlled. They're Republican controlled. So the people in charge of that election in Georgia are all Republicans. So again, here his accusations look absolutely ridiculous. The other bit that really kind of showed it up was his complete inconsistency. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, he was initially ahead and then Biden caught him and overtook him. So whilst he was ahead, he wanted the vote stopping in Pennsylvania. In Arizona, it was the other way around. Biden was ahead and Trump was catching him up. So he wanted the vote counting to stop in Pennsylvania but continue in Arizona. And again, what this immediately demonstrates is what he's interested in is the outcome. He's not interested in the fairness of it. As of now, as I speak, and this might change, and I might well be coming back and doing another video on this, he has failed to produce any evidence at all, really, of anything of any significance that's going to have any impact on the outcome. Most of his early challenges have been rejected by the courts. The only one that's really gone in his favour to any degree is one where the Supreme Court said, well, actually segregate those votes, so if there is something to look at, it can be looked at properly later. But again, nothing that necessarily suggests there's any problem. He's currently losing the popular vote by 4 million. And this really does make his claims of I've won this election by miles just seem absolutely ridiculous. And the gap in most of the battleground states means that recounts are unlikely to make any change. I mean, it is unlikely that they've miscounted by 10,000. Again, if you've got a gap of 1 or 200, 300, 500, maybe even 1,000, you get a recount, and when we're talking about millions of votes, we might see an alteration. But when the size of gaps we're talking, yes, they're small gaps for populations of this size, but they're not small enough gaps to be overturned by a recount. Why did Biden win? And these are some of the key reasons. Well, part of it is this huge jump in voter turnout, which is more important for the Democrats than it is for the Republicans, because traditionally a lot of the Democrat supporters are groups where the voter turnout is lower, is not as high as it is for other groups. For example, the black vote, the urban vote, the voter turnout in these areas looks to have jumped really dramatically. There's been a load of really powerful work being done by the Democrat Party and by other movements that have got the black vote out. And Biden, in his acceptance speech and in other things he said, has really kind of said, like, Black America is behind me, and I acknowledge that, and this will not be forgotten. So in 2016, Trump mobilized his base. He got people voting who previously just didn't vote. They hadn't voted at all. And so we got this surprise with Trump, because places where we weren't expecting voting in large numbers, the voting turnout was much higher, and it was pro-Trump. He appealed to people who had been disengaged from politics. Now, Clinton was not an inspiring choice for a lot of Democrats, and so the Democrat base, a lot of the Democrat base stayed at home and in that it let Trump in, let the Republicans win. Now Biden learned from that, and Biden and his campaign did absolutely everything they could to get their base out, to get the progressive vote out, to get the young vote out, to get the black vote out, in lots of states to get the Hispanic vote out. COVID-19 is a big reason why Trump lost. He was in a strong position before it hit. The economy was doing well, and normally, and again, I've done a video on incumbency. Normally, if you've got an economy functioning and doing reasonably well, and you've got an incumbent running for a second term, the 70-odd% of the time they win, and normally there has to be a really significant reason why they lose. And I think we can argue that one of the significant reasons why Trump lost is because of the COVID-19 crisis. His mishandling of the crisis cost him with older voters, it cost him with working class men who lost their jobs, it cost him with the black community, Hispanic community, because they were disproportionately hit by it. So it played a really big role in the election. Black Lives Matters played a really big role because it links to the first point about this huge jump in voter turnout, and Black Lives Matters and all the anger and the protest was there, and that underlying that is a movement that is getting people politically engaged, and it is getting them involved. And they got them determined to turn out and have their say and vote against Trump. So that has been really important. And we've seen Biden not only win the big cities, but win the big cities in such dramatic style to nullify, to a large extent, in a lot of key battleground states, Trump's advantage in the countryside. The choice of Kamala Harris as VP is also really, really important in Biden's victory, and it boosts support across various groups. It boosted support across the black community, it boosted support across the American Asian community, it boosted support amongst women, and female votes have been important for Trump in 2016. And so that choice was a really big deal with Biden and made a big impact. There have been demographic shifts. So there are states which were in 2020 less white than they were in 2016, that were more urban and more suburban than they were in 2016, where the Hispanic population had grown since 2016. And all these things shifted stuff in the direction of the Democrats. One of the key things we can't forget about Biden's victory, I think, is some of it is to do with Biden's qualities. He's calm, he's moderate, he's experienced, but a lot of that it's simply an anti-Trump vote, because Trump is volatile and divisive and aggressive, and in the eyes of many people, discriminatory, and therefore Biden did quite well through not being Trump. Just going to go through some of the key races. So the Midwest, the Rust Belt, so that's Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. In 2016, Trump won all three, and this is the fall. They talked about the falling of the Blue Wall, a bit like we talked about the fall of the Red Wall in the UK across the north of England in 2019. So Biden, born in Pennsylvania, resident in Delaware, he appealed more to the white working class men than Clinton had done, largely because he is one. So his poor background, origin in Pennsylvania, this really helped. He also got this huge turnout, and again, as part of this is his association with Obama, this huge support from the black vote in the cities such as Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Detroit. And this has to be remembered as one of the major reasons why he wins nationally, and this is one of the reasons why he won in these key states. And then Biden also dominated, or the pro-Biden vote dominated in the educated population, in the suburban areas. And so if you look at some of the stats, if you look at college educated versus non-college educated, well, college educated overwhelmingly voted for Biden. The suburbs, which had voted Trump, now turned against Trump, voted in the Midwest, voted for Biden. And Trump's personality played quite a role in that, as well as positives about Biden. So Biden also focused on this area more than Clinton did, and this is a common theme, I think, with politicians and political parties, where they start taking a bit of their country for granted. And the Rust Belt had been solidly Democrat for a long time, and it was kind of one way you just go, oh right, yeah, we win the Midwest, and Trump targeted it. The Democrats didn't do enough to defend it and lost it in 2016. Well, Biden doesn't make that mistake, and he went all in to make sure to win this, and he outspent Trump enormously in the Midwest. Although, and again I said this already, although the dwindling of Trump's lead, and then the reversal of Trump's lead since election day looks a bit strange. It is completely explainable by the different ways in which the two sides got their supporters to vote. The Southeast, and in this I'm thinking of Florida and Georgia, and one has definitively gone towards Trump, and the other looks like it's going to be Biden, but is very, very close, and I think we're going to have a recount. So Florida is one of the few success stories for Trump, in particular the growth of the Latino vote amongst Cuban and Venezuelan Americans. And what he manages to do is he manages to convince them that Biden is a socialist. Now, from a UK perspective, the idea that any of the politicians in America are even vaguely socialist is quite laughable. The idea that Biden, who is right central in the American kind of political spectrum, is anything vaguely socialist is definitely not the case. But Trump manages to persuade populations that are going to be really put off by the idea of any kind of socialism. He manages to persuade those populations that Biden is a socialist, and so particularly the Cuban vote in Miami did a lot to nullify areas where Biden was picking up and getting huge advantages elsewhere in the country. And so Florida stays with Trump, and the fact that Trump essentially lives in Florida, has had rallies in Florida throughout his time in office, spends a lot of time there in his golf resort, that helps him as well. In Georgia, we've seen a big demographic shift in Georgia, and that again, as Georgia's become less white and more urban and suburban, that helps the Democrats. And the huge numbers in Atlanta, for example, the huge pro-Biden numbers in Atlanta were key to giving Biden a lead. It's about 10,000 as I speak now. Again, that might well shift, and the recount might shift it again. Now, this is a big shift because it is whether win or lose, and I think he's going to win it, but even if he loses it very narrowly, this is a big shift because this is traditionally a kind of solid Republican state. So it was last won by a Democrat in '92. And only Jimmy Carter and Clinton have won the state. Carter twice, Clinton once, since 1972. And so this is a big shift. And part of this is demographic, and part of this is anger at Trump and appeal of Biden. The Southwest is a really interesting one. So we've got Nevada and Arizona with 6 and 11 electoral college votes comparatively. And we've seen things like the Native American vote, the Latino vote, and the Black vote that have really helped the Democrats in these areas. The urban and suburban vote in places like Las Vegas and Reno and Phoenix and Tucson have really boosted the Democrat vote. So again, Trump's winning in the countryside, in the rural areas here, but in the towns and the cities and the suburban areas that surround them, there's a huge boost to Biden. Young voters turned out and overwhelmingly voted Democrat. Trump won the white vote in these states, but lost in all other groups. And this is something that the Republican Party is going to have to very seriously think about going forward. Is it just the white party? And if it's just the white party, that's going to put it into real problems in states like this, where the demographics are changing, and this could be a long-term problem for them. And not only in some of these states, but kind of universally across the USA. Some things to think about. So Biden received the most votes of any presidential candidate in the USA ever. Very impressive. But we must remember, Trump, therefore, received the second most votes of any presidential candidate ever. So if you just look at percentages, you can see Biden's won, but the 75 million that Biden's got is the most anybody's got, but nobody's got over 70 million before. So Trump, when he says I've got more votes than any standing president has ever got, he's not lying. Now, Biden's beaten him, but he has received a remarkable number of votes. So the USA is highly divided. So you will see celebrating in all these major cities across the USA, but the attitudes in the countryside, in the small towns, in the villages of America, where there's the white picket fences and all that stuff, is going to be very, very different. Obviously, the cities is where we're likely to have the cameras and we're likely to see it. And yeah, you see places like Washington, where I think the Democrat vote is something like 90%. Then it's not an enormous surprise that there's lots of people celebrating. But don't think that's how the whole of America is reacting. It wasn't a bad night for the Republicans overall. They gained houses. They gained seats in the House, 4 so far as I speak. They're most likely going to hold on to the Senate, or at least they're going to be very close to holding on in the Senate. It's going to depend on some runoff votes to do with the rules in Georgia. If it's really close, then it goes to a runoff election with only the top 2 candidates in it, and they're going to be very closely fought, and we'll find out in January how that's gone. So it looks like actually it's Trump, not the Republican Party, that has lost and been rejected. And that's going to be a really interesting one going forward. And I think, again, it seems to be something that Trump's not quite got his head around, where he's going, well, how can I have lost when actually the Republican vote has gone up and they've won these seats that they hadn't won before, etc. Well, I think the bit that he doesn't want to hear is it's because people don't like you as much as they like the Republican Party, and a lot of those 70 million votes you got aren't because you're you got those because you're the Republican candidate. We also possibly have seen a return to the idea of split ticket voting, where it could well be argued that the American people have chosen for a division of power in federal government. So Biden's gains have not been matched by the rest of the Democrat Party. Trump's defeat has not been matched by the rest of the Republican Party. And therefore, what we're going to have to see going forward is compromise and working together. So it is likely that the progressives and the Democrats are going to be frustrated and aren't going to get all the stuff that they want. Please remember, Trump is still president until January. So the states will certify their election results between November the 10th and December the 11th. Electoral college votes will be cast on the 14th of December. On the 3rd of January, a new Congress will be sworn in. The electoral college votes will be counted in Congress on the 6th of January. And then on the 20th of January, we will have inauguration date. Now, during that period, there is going to be a lot of stuff happening. There's going to be court cases, I'm sure. There's going to be recounts. There's going to be like a gazillion tweets from a very angry Trump. At some point during that, hopefully he'll concede. But it's going to probably be quite messy. Another interesting bit on this, so we can see the Democrats have rock solidly got the black vote, although Trump got more black votes than he had done before. But the one area of voting which is going to be hugely significant in America going forward is the Latino vote. One of the things we saw in this election is a lot more nuanced maybe than the Democrats had given it credit for. So it was the Latino vote was key for Democrat growth in Arizona and Georgia and Nevada, but it was also key for Republican victory in Florida. So both parties on this particular area of demographic have got quite a long way to go in making sure that they're fully engaged with these communities and understand these communities and what it is that they want, what it is that representing them will look like. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that's made a bit of sense to you in terms of what's been going on, and hopefully it won't go immediately out of date and it will remain useful for at least a decent period of time. If it's been useful to you, please hit the like, share it if you think you know other people who it would benefit from, and if you are interested in all things politics and history and you haven't done so already, then please hit the subscribe button and get more updates. I'm going to be covering the whole of the A-level politics specification. We're also covering entire specs in areas such as Tudor Britain and Tsarist and Communist Russia and modern Britain 1951 to 2007. So there's loads of stuff on the channel. So hit that subscribe and get notification as more gets added. Thank you very much for watching.